this isn't just the end of a negotiation, right? It really is the beginning of a new economic model for women's sports. And to me, that's incredibly exciting. It's the beginning of that. And so I think what we will see in years to come will be how we will all capitalize on this. And I think it's wonderful for the women, but I think it's wonderful for the world too.
Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening with me, your host, Chris Hayes. So in 2019, just 7 years ago, the Taiwanese Canadian billionaire Joseph Tsai is his name, purchased a WNBA franchise, a Women's National Basketball Association franchise called the New York Liberty. And he purchased them for, we think, like $14 million, between $10 and $15 million. He moved the New York Liberty from their home games, which they were playing in Westchester County, to the heart of Brooklyn, into the same venue the Nets play in at the Barclays Center. He also purchased the Nets that year. And now the New York Liberty are worth $450 million, almost $500 million. Again, just to give you this investment, just run the math in your head. Buys it 7 years ago for $14 million, now worth $500 million. Now, that is an extreme example of what's been happening to women's sports in the WNBA, but it is in line with what has been an absolute explosion in women's professional sports in America. And there's a bunch of different contexts that's produced this. One is, ever since Title IX, we've seen, this imperative to have equal spending at the collegiate level on women's sports. That's created an entire generation of women athletes who are very, very good, are some of the best in the world, and then get out of college and are looking to continue being professional athletes. That pipeline has then found a place in increasing professional women's sports, which have graduated from being a kind of junior partner and a backwater to being incredibly, explosively lucrative, popular undertakings. I mean, just speaking for myself, like, we are season ticket holders for the New York Liberty. My 12-year-old son, who's basketball obsessed, will like talk about WNBA players with the other like boys in his class. They'll talk about like Sabrina Ionescu or Stewie, and we'll put on we will flip between women's March Madness games and men's March Madness games like it's nothing, in a way that was unthinkable to me when I was a boy and a 12-year-old obsessed basketball player. And all of this has created this incredible revenue growth, incredible cultural interest. I think it's amazing, but there has been a real fight over who gets to get the gains of the money that is now being produced, right? So if Joseph Tsai can put in $14 million and have a franchise worth $500 million, it's pretty insane that some of the players, for instance, the world famous Caitlin Clark, when she was drafted into the league, her rookie season was making $77,000 a year. This fight has recently exploded with labor negotiations between the players' union and the WNBA which they've reached a tentative agreement. And I thought it was a good opportunity to think about the explosion of women's sports and sports unions and labor at this moment when live sports have become this kind of last island in the entertainment marketplace. And the reason they're the last island in the entertainment marketplace is every piece of content produced at any time is in competition with every other piece of content ever produced at every moment. It doesn't matter what it is. It's my show at 8 p.m. It's the latest Universal Pictures movie. You can always just look at anything at any time, with one exception: a live sports game. A live sports game, you have to watch when it's happening so you can find out the outcome. It isn't like, oh, well, I can watch an old episode of The Office, or I can scroll through TikTok, or I can pull up this movie on Netflix. No, the game's happening right now. It's not going to be interesting 2 years from now, right? That urgency has created this kind of marketing premium on sports. And so the entire world of investment is looking for more sports opportunities, and one place you're going to find that is in women's sports. And as sports gets more lucrative, as women's sports grows, the question of how that pie gets split up becomes more and more interesting. And so today, I'm really excited to have Tamika Tremolio. She's the former executive director of the National Basketball Players Association. She was basically the head of the players union when they were doing their own collective bargaining agreement. She's managing director at Secretariat, which is a consulting firm that she leads global sports consulting and is an expert in the sports business. Tamika, it's great to have you in the program.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me start with this sort of growth question, just from your perspective of someone who's been in this industry. Your understanding of what's happening, not even just women's sports. Let's talk about sports as a whole. What does seem to be this kind of explosive growth, this obsessive desire by every new streaming outlet and every platform to get its hands on that revenue because sports have this distinct thing they can offer that nothing else can.
Yeah. So, first of all, I think your framing around this was spot on, right? It is exploding. Obviously, women's sports is exploding. So, when you look at sort of sports in general, it's obviously this asset class that everyone's paying attention to. Not that historically it hadn't existed, but because we're seeing such tremendous growth, people are really paying attention to what's happening in the marketplace. And the challenges that we're having are precisely what you just said, in that if the valuation of a team is increasing exponentially, then why aren't the salaries increasing exponentially? And I think that's where we came in with the challenges that we've just witnessed over the last several months with the WNBA.
Talk a little bit about what you think is leading the exponential growth. I mean, my one theory there, right, is that the kind of the time-bound urgency of a sports competition now operates in a different space than all other content because of the way that content is developed that makes it this kind of premium. So if you want to guarantee eyeballs, this has this thing that you can make a movie, maybe people like it, maybe people not. You might put out a multi-million-dollar, high-budget, star-studded prestige TV show on a streamer and like people find it or they don't. But like people are going to watch March Madness and they're going to watch a WNBA playoff game because they got to know the outcome.
That's right. And I think it's recession proof. I think sports is the one thing that we have found that has been recession proof. People are watching it regardless of all of the other things that are going on. It also is something that unites people with varying backgrounds and diversity. I think that's part of what, particularly as Americans, but I would say throughout the world, we're all craving is something to bring us together. And I think that's been part of it. But it's also such an exciting time. And watching sort of the evolution of women in terms of sports overall has been incredibly exciting.
Yeah. So give me your view on the growth of women's sports too, and why it has happened. I mean, it's, women have been playing sports forever. There was women's March Madness, I think, when I was a kid. I just didn't know it existed. It wasn't being televised. How much of this is chicken and egg in terms of interest leading to things like, oh, now the games are televised, and how much is the games are televised, so now you can get interested?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of the chicken versus the egg, right? But to your point, it is about the content and it's about fan engagements, and fans are engaging in women's sports. And as a result, it's allowed women's sports to evolve significantly and to be more valuable. So if you can have a number of fans that are now increasing, that are watching the game on a regular basis, yeah, I think you started with the example of you switching from March Madness between women and men. If that's happening, that means you're getting more fans, more eyeballs on it. Sponsorships are increasing significantly. The value of an individual player, the value of a team, the value of the league, all of that increases because there are more eyes that are on it now.
But do you think the eyes are cultural? Do you think it's like exposure? Do you think the quality is better? I mean, I do think that's part of it too, like partly because of the Title IX change and the pipeline, like the whatever inequities there were, structural inequities that produce this kind of difference in skill or ability, right? There's physical differences, we can put that aside. They're rapidly diminishing because you're watching extremely high level players.
Well, Kristen, it's a great point. I don't think that the quality of the execution on behalf of the players is any different. I think we
You
have had
don't. That's interesting.
I don't. I think we've had extraordinary women playing the game of basketball, extraordinary men playing the game of basketball. I don't think that that has changed. What I do think has changed is sort of the entire dynamic over content. So, for example, I think NIL is what has changed the game. The fact that you are actually receiving, additional compensation because of your name, image, and likeness, that's changing the game. And quite frankly, women do it exceptionally well in terms of branding themselves. And they've started doing it at a much earlier age. So in
That's
college,
interesting.
we're seeing women's sports actually, exponentially increasing because they're actually able to get out there and brand. They're actually sponsored at an earlier age. So they understand now the business of sports. They're much more sophisticated businesswomen when they enter into the professional league than what we have seen historically.
Huh.
That too is true of the men, but we're seeing that more on the women's side.
Yeah. So just so people know who don't know this, name, image, and likeness (NIL) is this. It started as a kind of carve out loophole in order to pay student athletes who were clearly producing tremendous economic value for a bunch of people, schools, networks, all sorts of people, but we're not getting any of the benefits. And in fact, we're barred from getting any of the financial benefits.
That's
That
correct.
changed a number of years ago, in which the NCAA allowed for you couldn't pay a player to play, but you could pay for their name, image, and likeness, which is to say endorsement deals. Now,
Yes.
that started out rather narrowly, like huge stars like Caitlin Clark, who is the biggest WNBA star, one of the biggest, was certainly, I think, the biggest NCAA women's basketball player ever in terms of like fame. She was appearing in State Farm ads before
Yes.
she even, right? Am I right about that? Before she even got to the WNBA, like you would be watching national televised commercials with Jake from State Farm, and there would be Caitlin Clark, which, to your point, like creates a level of just awareness, fame, celebrity that is just completely inconceivable a generation earlier.
That's exactly right. And if you are a woman who was playing in college and you are receiving millions of dollars for your name, image, and likeness, and now you've joined the WNBA and you're paid $76,000, like
Yes.
something doesn't, the
Well,
math isn't mathing, right? And so I think that's where we've started to see some of those challenges.
well, I think, to stay on this, I mean, I think, Caitlin Clark became such a phenomenon. She's a she played at Iowa, and she was, a record-setting shooter. She was like a Steph Curry level shooter. I mean, her and Steph Curry are probably the two best three-point shooters that I've ever watched in my life. Um, and she became this national phenomenon. She got this NIL deal. She then gets drafted. She's the top draft pick in the WNBA. She goes to play for the Indiana team and makes the league rookie salary of $77,000 a year. And I do think that was a key moment in the development of like public awareness of
Yeah.
the problem at the WNBA. Because like you could read headlines about the valuation of the Liberty is now $500 million, and he put $14 million in. Everyone knew who Caitlin Clark was, who pays any attention to women's basketball. And then everyone saw that headline.
Yes.
That was, she's going to make $77,000 a year. And that was I mean, that's a tough look for the league.
It is. There is no question. It's a tough look for anybody, right? Because it just logically doesn't make sense, which I think to some extent was one of the things that they were able to capitalize on is the public opinion, right? The public opinion was like, pay them what they're worth because we can see that the teams are worth so much more. Why aren't they being compensated so much more? It became an issue more of equity, right? As opposed to parity. Because I think one of the challenges people kept comparing them to men. That's not the right move. The move is like, how are they being valued for what they bring to the table? And we see what they are bringing to the table. So it's really hard to think of someone making $77,000 when you go to an arena and it's sold out. And then there are 15,000 people and you know what the cost of a ticket is, but they're paid less than $2,000 a game. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I went to a sold out arena to watch Caitlin Clark play and bought $100 worth of concessions from my family of
Mhm.
five and like, you know what I mean? And paid whatever for the tickets. And yes, you have exactly that calculation. If we take a step back for a second and think about how you approach this, you were executive director of the Players Association, the NBA. So just to put on your like, okay, I'm the executive director of a sports union, right? What is your approach of going into a contract negotiation? What do you want to know? What do you sort of do before the negotiations? And then what's your strategy approach in the actual negotiations?
Well, first of all, I will say that it is incredibly intentional. And so you are right, Chris, that that was my role with the men in 2023. But even before that, I was working with the WNBA. And so I did have the privilege of sitting at the table in 2020 when we were going through those negotiations. So very similar to where we are now, not as long of a period of time, but certainly real issues. And in fact, it was the first time that revenue share had actually even been brought into the conversations, the first time that it's actually been, instituted in the CBA. And in fact, we saw this year that they actually participated in revenue share. That is a very big deal for them. So when I'm going into the negotiations, just as with the women that are going into negotiations as well, we're thinking about what it is that we want to make sure gets accomplished, right? We want to think about what it is that we want to see the outcome to be at the end of the day on behalf of the collective. So it's not based on what, the benefit will be to one player or one class of players, rookies versus veterans. It's about what helps to make the pie bigger for everyone, where everyone can win, because there's always going to be a little bit of give and take in a negotiation.
Okay, but let's talk about that because you just identified two different things, right? There's going to be some questions about distribution within a contract. What is the guaranteed rookie contract? Is there a max contract? How much leverage is going to be earned by like the best players? Like how high is their ceiling? How high is the floor? And those are places where you might have internal division, right? Or at least internal distributional effects, right? The contract's going to look different to a guy who's coming off the bench at the the ninth player on to LeBron James, let's say. But before you get to that, there's how much money, what's the total part of the pie that the players are going to get? So let's just talk about that. Like, how do you go into figuring out how much money the league's actually making, which is, my understanding is a more complex question to answer than you might think, and how much and how to get labor share of that income as high as possible?
Yes. So great question. And that's a lot of what it came down to. So let's take the 2020 CBA, for instance. They were entitled to 9.3% of revenue. That's point
This is the
number one.
WNBA
This is
CBA.
the WNBA
Yep.
CBA. And so that meant that whatever the revenue was, that then they would calculate that percentage and they would pay it out. So this year, for the very first time, the women were paid about $8 million. But what that requires is that you actually understand the numbers and that there's some transparency in terms of the financials. And as you know, from what I've read, and I'm sure what you've read as well, that wasn't as transparent as they would have liked it to be, because the spreadsheet is only as valuable to you as you trust the person that put the spreadsheet together, right? And so it's really important that they felt like the numbers were accurate, that they were actually clearly assessing what the value was, what the actual revenue was. So that's a part of all of this. And obviously there's the ability to audit, but that becomes part of this entire negotiation.
Well, your background's in forensic accounting, right? If I'm not mistaken. So,
It is.
there's in another context, people might be more familiar with this, like the classic cliche of what's called Hollywood accounting, right? Which is, someone gets points on a deal, which means a percentage of net profit. What you want to get points on gross revenue, right? Because if it's net, then the sort of Hollywood accountants at the studio can find all sorts of places where the movie lost money. And this is a sort of famous cliche of these huge blockbusters that like on paper lost money. And the reason they on paper lost money is so that they don't have to pay people that have percentages of net revenue. My understanding is there was a strong feeling, and I'm not saying who's right or wrong because I just don't know the books, but there's a strong feeling by a lot of people, particularly as you're sitting in a crowded stadium or arena, that the WNBA was saying like, we're barely making any money. And people were looking around being like, that can't possibly be the case. Like, is that a fair assessment of at least the suspicion that the player side had going into this?
Well, Chris, you know what? I think it even goes deeper than that. So, first of all, you say you aren't making any money, but we want to pay you based on what you're making. So, we all know that 10% of zero is still zero, right? So,
Right.
who would ever agree to gross? Because it's basically, you're saying, I'm sorry, to net, because you're basically saying that that's what you were making. Now,
Right.
I'm just going to take a second and back up really quickly to share with you a basic concept of gross versus net. So,
Please.
essentially, if my paycheck, so what I make in salary
Hmm.
is what is actually considered your gross.
Yep.
Then you have Social Security that's taken out, you have
Yep.
Medicare that's taken out. And oh, you know what? I may have decided that I want to take all of my cash and put it into a retirement account.
Right.
And so now I'm bringing home a dollar.
Right. Right.
Right?
Right.
Because
Right.
maybe I don't need it to pay bills, etcetera, and I'm gonna give you 10% of that dollar. That's
Right.
essentially what they were doing. It
Right.
just
Right.
doesn't make sense. So what we did see last year is that it was actually doing very well from a revenue perspective, but then they did the things that they needed to do to ramp up in terms of getting ready for this media deal, which meant that they spent hundreds of millions of dollars, which meant that the net went down significantly and
Uh,
they weren't paid anything. You can always make the decision. You could decide to make a distribution. You could decide to pay your coach $25 million. That's money that's less to you. So going at gross revenue means that you get to share in the upside completely.
right. And the point is that net, the person you're negotiating against on the other side, the owners, they get to control what net is because they're controlling the spending. So
That's
if you're
right.
taking from net, they could be like, oh, well, we had to invest this money, or I had to take this awesome vacation, or I had to do whatever. But you can always spend down that money, but you have no say over it, which is why it's so important from the player perspective in these negotiations to be getting a percentage of gross, is what you're
That's
saying.
right. Absolutely. And it's also why it was so important that you had to negotiate the little intricacies like charter flights, because again, that's below the line. So for example, you are now they have agreed to pay for chartered flights for players. That's an actual expense.
Right.
And so that would come after gross revenue. So, the fact that you have to go through and,
Oh,
actually pick through
right.
some of the things that seem so minute just seems ridiculous, but you have to do it because otherwise they wouldn't do it because they're thinking, now I've got it. That's more money coming from me. What they are doing now is truly transformational, right? Because they're really looking at, look, we're going to pay you, and your salary is going to increase. We know the cap went up significantly, et cetera, but also we're going to share 20% in gross revenue. And we're going to give you all these other things, housing, all the things that obviously we've seen in the term sheet.
Right, I see what you're saying. So that if you're not intentional about how you're negotiating this, you can end up in this where they're kind of double dipping, right? Because they're
That's
using
right.
expenses for one part of the CBA like charter, right? But now they can take that out of if it's net revenue, they can be, well, that's an expense. You have to another reason you got to separate out gross revenue is because some of this contract is going to be basically mandated expenses they have to pay for. For instance, it had been the case that
Exactly.
everyone was flying they were just flying commercial, I think, right? I mean,
That's correct.
which by the
That
way,
is correct.
if you're 6'7" and you're traveling all the time, like that's not super fun to fly commercial. Also, this league is worth a ton of money. So is the sequencing of the negotiation how do you sequence it? So is the first fight about what is the share of the revenue or what's the pie? And then you get into here's what we're gonna do rookies, here's what we're gonna do in veterans, here's what we're gonna do for travel. Like how do you even conceptualize that? Because you've actually sat at the table multiple times and done this.
Yeah, so really it starts with having the discussions with the players, right? I mean, obviously, you hear for many years things that are challenging for them, things that they're concerned about, et cetera. So you have a really long list of things that they want to change. You then sit down with the players, and each team has a player representative that
Yep.
comes to the meetings that share what their concerns are, and then you prioritize what matters the most. And just as a point of clarification, there were some flights that were chartered. So if you have back to
Right.
backs, things like that. So it wasn't
Right.
100% commercial, but just so
Right.
that we're clear, but the majority were certainly commercial flights. But does that matter? Like you and I both said, you're 6'7". Yeah, that matters.
Yeah, it's
If
gonna
you're
matter.
sitting in economy,
Yeah.
even if economy with extra leg room, it,
Yeah.
it matters. Not to mention the fact that you also are people who want you to sign their autograph, and you're not getting to rest, and
Yep.
travel in and of itself can be daunting. So it's all of those things that really become a part of the negotiation. But it is something that the players have agreed really matters to them, and they share with you sort of the level of priority. And then of course the executive committee carries that forward. They come to the table with the executive director, usually counsel, usually economists that have run tons of scenarios, which is the role that I was playing in 2020. And it's so that we can arrive at what the best outcome is.
So you're in this negotiation, you've done all this. There's this sort of process of kind of consensus building, priority identification that's happening through the structure of the union, team reps talking to players, um, union leadership, an executive committee. You kind of come up with like, here are the big things that we want out of this negotiation. Here's what players have raised. Then now you're in the hotel boardroom and there's like the long table, there's a bunch of people on either side. um how do those go? Like, literally, I've never been in one of those negotiations. Like, take me through like day one. Like, you sit down and what's the next thing that happens?
Yeah. So, obviously day one is a little different than day 10. But in
Yeah,
day
no, I mean,
one, when you show up there, you really are, everybody's really hopeful. Right? Everybody's hoping that you can come to the right conclusion. It's pretty intense. I think for a lot of the women, there are things that they want to make sure really happen. And I think on behalf of the league, there are things that they want to make sure happen. I think at the end of the day, everyone wants this to be there to be labor peace. We want them to continue to go on. And quite frankly, when you think about the momentum that the women's leagues had, I mean, the last thing you wanted was for, things not to start up in April,
I
right?
mean, a
And so
strike or a walkout would have been. I mean, given the trajectory the WNBA is on, given the momentum, given the interest now showed in these offseason leagues like Unrivaled, like the demand is just so high. I mean,
it is.
it would be devastating for any kind of work stoppage.
That is right. But at the same time, what would also be devastating is for the women not to get what they believe they are worth, right? This is the one time that they really had everything going in the right direction for them, that they
Right.
really had the leverage, and they did have to take advantage of it. So you're torn between the two, right? We also know that emotions are pretty high, right? Because the women are tired. They're doing negotiations in the middle of a season, so you're still playing the games at the same time you're trying to make sure you're responding, that you're giving them the things that they need. So it's a really daunting task, and it starts the minute it stops. So I promise you, Chris, they're already thinking about the next negotiation. They're already thinking about what this means, and the impact. So it's a daunting process. It's a marathon for certain over the next 7 years. So by the time you get to the table, you're already exhausted. So then by the time you get to day 10, you really feel beaten, right? You're hearing things from the players, you're hearing things from the public, you're running so many scenarios. Everything that you're doing, impacts something else. So there's a lot of scenario testing that takes place as well.
When you study negotiation or you read sort of literature on this, right? There's a bunch of sort of game theory models of it and um, what the kind of threshold equilibriums are for each side, how you get to that equilibrium, and the sort of assumption of rational actors. But there's also a lot of emotion involved. I mean, in the WNBA's context, players were pissed and vocal and really vocal about it. And they were, wearing those t-shirts saying, pay us what you owe us. But it also felt to me like that wasn't just performance for leverage. You could hear it in the voices of the players, particularly during this sort of period before this negotiation where the league's blowing up and they're still getting compensated poorly. I guess my question is like, how much does that matter? How much does the human aspect of emotion matter when you're in the room? And how much does the kind of economics of bargaining and game theory end up winning out in the end?
Yeah, so you know all the time when people say it's not personal, business isn't personal. Well, the truth is that that's all business is personal, right? And so the reality is it matters a lot.
It does.
And the emotions that were at play in this negotiation really were very impactful, right? It didn't mean that they couldn't step back and be reasonable because quite frankly, emotions are high in all negotiations. I think in this particular instance they became very public and it was clear that there was a breakdown of trust. And when you are negotiating from the, sort of leverage point that they were negotiating from, and you're not getting even close to what you want, it's deteriorating trust even more. And so it's so important that they had the relationship where they really trusted one another, at least trusted that what they were telling them was true and that when I get this spreadsheet from you, the numbers accurately represent where we are as a league. And I think because they didn't feel like that was happening, that there were other motives at play, it made it even harder to negotiate.
Ultimately, it looks like they have the contours of a deal now. Um,
Absolutely.
and you think it's a good one.
I think it is a win for everyone, meaning I believe that it is a win for the women of the WNBA. I believe it is a win for the rest of the world in women's sports. Everyone waits to see what happens in women's
Right,
sports. It sets the
right,
tone for what our soccer players do. It may set the tone
right.
for what flag football looks like. Everyone waits for that. It's a really big deal.
Right, so the reverberations here because it's now I think I think WNBA is now the largest women's professional sports league in terms of, I think, revenue and viewership, past
Yes.
soccer recently, that it's not just what it means for those players, but it has this really profound effect, you're saying, for all women's sports, and all of these different unions will be going in their own negotiations with leagues.
Yeah, I mean, that was tremendous pressure because it wasn't just about the game of basketball. It was about sports, women in sports entirely. That's a lot of pressure for them. And I think they really stood up for it. And I do believe that it was a win holistically. I think, everyone's incredibly proud of where they came out for sure.
You I wanna talk a little bit about your experience in the NBA where you're executive director of the Players Association. One of the things that's been really interesting to me, I'm a lifelong basketball fan, a basketball junkie. I love basketball. I played it poorly. I was never very good, unfortunately.
What position? What
I was like a
position, Chris?
guard. I was a guard. I was basically a point guard, but I was always undersized and I was not that good. And I was slow and I couldn't jump. But I've got two kids that play it very, very seriously. My daughter and my son. I spend a lot of time. I spend a shocking amount of time at AAU youth basketball
Oh, yes. Yes.
tournaments in
Me too.
place like York, Pennsylvania, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Mannheim, Pennsylvania, and all the great cities of Central
Yes.
PA.
Yes.
Have you ever been to Spooky Nook? Do you know that place?
Oh, I've been there too. I know exactly where that
That is
is.
the wildest spot. And this is for people that don't know. This is this enormous sports complex in Lancaster, PA. I can't even describe how big it is, but you'll be there, and it'll have like a 50-team basketball tournament and 20 girls cheerleader teams and a field hockey tournament, and they'll be running a track enterprise. It's the craziest thing.
I know.
So,
Youth sports is out of
well,
control. It's really
yes,
is.
that's a whole other podcast. But the reason I bring this up is like one thing that's been really interesting to me about basketball in the last 5 years. For so long, basketball players, you would only hear them in the little sound bites you get from them in the locker room after a game. And this is after someone has exerted themselves tremendously in a very strange environment where they're basically coached just to give cliches so that they don't make waves. And everything they would say would be interpreted through reporters. And now in the last 5 years, you have this incredible explosion of athletes just speaking for themselves, particularly basketball players. And I found it so amazing. I've just been so sort of blown away by the like charisma, sophistication, just the interesting full complexity of seeing these athletes in a way that 5 years ago you couldn't have. And as someone who got to talk to them closely in this context of negotiation, I'm curious how your sort of perception of them has evolved over time as well.
No, absolutely. Well, and Chris, honestly, I have worked with the players since, 2010. So, coming up
Long
on almost
time.
17 years, a long time. And I remember from day one just being so impressed with how business savvy they are. Many of them have been independent contractors since 7 or 8 years old. And now,
Right,
my
that's a good
gosh,
point, yeah.
and they've been negotiating deals for a really long time. Now, in this NIL world, they're also out and talking publicly, in the ninth grade, eighth grade. They're making, significant future decisions
That's
for
a great
their
point.
businesses. So I think it has required the level of maturity to increase exponentially, and we're just seeing that. But the thing that I am, most proud of is just how humble the individuals are who play the game of basketball, how caring they are for one another. So even in the NBA, like when you have the collective payments they receive, it's evenly split. It's not as if LeBron and Steph are going to receive more money than, Paolo, for instance, right? It's that they want to make sure that they're taking care of each other. And in this negotiation, we also saw that they were giving back to the veterans, that they wanted to make
Yes.
sure the veterans, the people who came before them, are actually being rewarded. And that's incredible. And I think that that just is a sign of how much they really care about each other. They care about the sport. It's a different level of individuals that we're getting the benefit of experiencing.
Meaning in this last NBA collective bargaining agreement, there was a bunch of money put aside for the healthcare and retirement benefits for veterans. And that means that current players negotiating to take a chunk of money that would have otherwise come to current players and choosing to give it to veterans.
That's right. And the same is true for the women. They did the exact same thing in this CBA
That's
negotiation.
right. In
So
fact, there's a bunch
it's
of
fantastic.
retroactive payments, aren't there? There's
Yes,
like
yes. It's so exciting. We have a WNBA player that's part of our team here at Secretary, and that's a big deal. They were playing
right,
for many, many years. A lot of them had to go overseas and play. I mean, they're part of what made up the last 30 years. That's amazing. And for them to be
right.
that selfless doing negotiations to make sure that they were being compensated, I think is really tremendous. Not only from, back payments, but to your point around healthcare and other benefits.
In terms of how leadership works in a league like that, how much this is always interesting to me, like the degree you'll see who the team's player reps are, and sometimes it's interesting. It's like who you would think, and sometimes it's not at all who you would think, right? So just in terms of how you think about leadership on the court, which is very different, how much does like how good you are and what your role is in a locker room correlate?
Yeah, I think it really depends. I mean, first of all, the women that are part of the WNBA are already true leaders, right? So now you're trying to choose a leader from the pool of leaders. And so it really will depend. Some teams choose, the individual that they think needs more exposure to the business of basketball. And so they want to get them in the room so they can learn more about the things that, are really critical to the success of the W. Some, particularly in a year in which you're going to have CBA negotiations, wants to make sure that they have someone that has the experience and the tenure and has done this
Right.
before. So it really is very dependent upon what's happening at that particular point in time.
The thing you said about humility is interesting because, one of the things that I've been thinking about watching serious youth sports up close is just how much, um, how humbling it is all the time, and how much the sort of thought you have about star athletes, I think cliche wise is like they're like they have this outsized popularity in their high school, and then they go to college where they're celebrities, and I think that's all true, but to get to the kind of level you have to get to be a WNBA or NBA player, um, means you're just constantly being humbled. You're constantly getting your butt kicked. You're constantly encountering people that are better than you and having to get better, and I wonder if you could talk a little about what you think that does do to the psychology of the people that do end up making it or are able to have a sort of sustainable career.
No, and I love that you mentioned that, Chris, because quite frankly, you're right. It is a tremendous amount of pressure. And as a result, it is something that pulls, particularly around mental health, right? It is something that they need to address and make sure that they're handling. And, the one thing that I love is for the first time ever, when I was executive director of the NBA, we had our first ever global mental health summit. And it was so important to me. I spent a lot of time, even at Deloitte, really focused on mental health and kindness and the importance of it. And even when I thought about how the fans were engaging with players, I wanted to make sure that they were thinking about them as human beings, as fathers, as
Well,
spouses,
that's
etc.
yeah, that's a
Right?
challenge.
Yes,
I think there's not a lot. I mean, I think particularly in the gambling era, you know, which we could talk about, I think is worthwhile talking about. But there's yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of dehumanization that happens, and part of it is just the nature of the thing. You know, you root for these people and you've never met them, and they're just on your screen, and it feels like a video game or whatever.
that's right, and
Um,
you forget that they're human beings, right? And so and that takes a toll on you, right? And when you fail, you're failing in front of millions of people. I always, I used to tell people like, what would happen if you got on your computer in the morning and you had a typo and the world goes, "Oh my god," right?
Look at
It
this
would
idiot.
be
Yeah,
yes, it would be the worst thing. And so it's really good
yeah.
that they started talking about it. And so CJ McCollum, for instance, would talk about going to therapy, right? And the significance of going to therapy. He would talk about it as if he were going to a dentist appointment. The reason that he had to do that was so that he could make it easier for the other person to talk about it. So we could make it the norm and reduce the stigma. So in our first mental health symposium, we had Broadway actors come in and pop
Hmm.
out of the audience and talk about some of the stories from Kevin Love and from others and their experiences. And so I just think that that is something that we can't lose sight of, not only the exhaustion, but the mental health. It's unfortunate that they will start back in April because I think they need a little bit of rest. I think they've been through a lot over the last 90 days, in particular, not to mention the last 17 months. And so I just think it would be great for us to not lose sight of the fact that it takes a toll on you.
I just mentioned gambling in passing, but I want to talk about it for a little bit. I mean, from your perspective as someone who's been in this business for a long time, you know, it feels like gambling has transformed everything. I mean, the degree to which it overwhelms your just experience of watching the game. Every ad, every sponsorship, you've got, live. Oh, here the over under has now changed because we're in the third quarter, and now you can get some bet in, some dynamic bet on the new line on this game, and everyone's pushing it. And one of the things I've heard a lot from athletes is that it's changed their experience of the game.
Mhm.
How has it changed sports, professional sports, from your perspective as someone who's been working in this field for decades? And what have you heard from athletes about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think one, we all know that first of all, gambling can be an addiction, right? And so with that becomes, there are lots of behaviors that come along with that. So that's number one challenge. The other is while it makes it exciting and it engages more people to, pay attention to the sport and to be interested in the outcome, it also means that people are putting more on the line perhaps than they have the ability to do so. So something that, may not be a big deal to some is a really big deal to others. And it's become so accessible and so easy. It's easy, one, to make a mistake, right? And do something you shouldn't be doing. But then it's also really easy to get engaged in it. And it brings about the emotional things that we talked about, even with the CBA, is that people get really emotional about a loss because now it means much more than someone simply lost a game. It means that you may have, lost a car or house or, your children's, lunch money. I mean, whatever that happens to be.
Yeah.
And so that really has just raised the bar significantly. So
I
it is something we have to be careful of.
I mean, you've also got, the combination of that with, social media such that like, I've seen athletes post, DMs they've gotten, including like college athletes, like you cost me $1,000, you expletive, 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 insult, whatever. I'm going to come to your house. Like, I mean, th- I- that there's something that there's going to be like real tragedy at the end of this road. I mean, I've heard
Mhm.
that from people if it keeps going this way.
Yeah, and Chris, I should say, I mean, it is a privilege to be in the role of the players. It's a privilege to be the executive director, but it really does. It's very difficult because it changes. I mean, I know that many people don't know this, but I would receive threats if if a player they thought did something that they shouldn't have done. And it could just be in the natural course of playing the game that someone
Right.
hurt their ankle or whatever happened to be the case. I never thought for 1 minute that I would become, someone that people would threaten because something happened in a game, right? But I think when you bring gambling in it, that's precisely what happens.
You just said an interesting thing, said it's a privilege. And one of the things that's so fraught about this entire relationship that fans have with the players, and particularly when it comes to money, right? And when it comes to negotiations, is people have these parasocial relationships with these people. They have this emotional bond to the team they root for. And also, like, these are people making millions and millions and millions of dollars, living incredibly luxurious lives. And, you know, and the people rooting for them are not, by and large. These are folks who are, working folks by and large. I mean, there's millions of people. There's all kinds of, and I think there's always this kind of complicated undercurrent that people have about play athletes and the amount of money they make. It's almost, it's a cliche about how they're all overpaid. It's ridiculous. And when, someone there's $100 million contract, now there's a $200 million contract. And I wonder how much you just encounter that in the world, right? In your position, and what those conversations are like with people who do have, I think, a very widely shared view that, like, it's absurd that anyone in the world makes that much money to shoot a basketball or hit a basketball.
Yeah, so, obviously that's a tough conversation, right? But the reality is, I think that people fail to realize how hard they work. Many of them miss Christmas, they miss holidays, they miss, birthdays, they miss the birth of their children. I mean, it
Yeah.
is a really challenging job. And while they see them play for particular games, they have been training every day for that. Everything that they do evolves around the game, the time they wake up, when they go to bed, all of those things, like they basically are controlled, and there's a price to pay when you are, at that level for certain. And quite frankly, I think the other piece of this is it's not that the world isn't demanding that, right? They're only receiving their appropriate share. So
I mean, that's the
that's
thing, right? Like, it's like, in some ways, it's like, right, who deserves any, like, how does, why does David Zaslav deserve a $300 million payday from this new merger? I mean, the market prices things the way market prices things.
that's right.
It is interesting to me, though. I think about this a lot, that, like, it's so striking as over the course of the last, 60 years, we've seen labor union density decline
Mm.
in the US, particularly private sector unions. There's fewer and fewer participants. That there is this sort of perverse consequence, which is the most visible public unions in the country by far are players' unions. And, it is a little bit of a skewed view insofar
Yes.
as, most unions are not representing like LeBron James or, Aaron Judge. And there is something sort of interesting about that. The fact that the players' unions occupy them, they're the most famous labor organizations in the country.
That's right. Yeah, but they're needed, right? Because you do have a collective that
I
I mean, and
totally agree.
obviously we see now when you think about colleges and universities, like how much it's needed, right? And so I think that it's a product. Usually it is in millionaires, right?
Right.
That unions are representing, but it is really critically important that we have them for that very reason.
Well, and I think what's interesting is fundamentally, like, even if it's a strange situation, when we get back to when we're talking about the WNBA, the thing you said about the leverage they have, it's like, why do they have the leverage? It's because fundamentally the value created by that league
That's
is produced by the value of the labor of the players playing.
that's
And
right.
if they all said no collectively, the $1 billion in value would disappear.
That's right. They're the greatest asset.
That's the asset. And so fundamentally, but the thing about that is that's true in a much more broader sense than just the WNBA.
That's
But
right.
that key insight, which is the insight of all collective bargaining, all negotiations, and the entire labor movement back to the 19th century, there's a sense of like everyone's replaceable, everyone's more transient. Like it's much easier for management to get the upper hand, even if it's the case that that same idea is often true in a lot of businesses that aren't the WNBA or aren't sports leagues.
Yes. No, that's absolutely correct. But this is why we have it, is to make sure there is some equity and fairness amongst the collective.
Do you have any worry that the this growth period is gonna pop or end? Like, right now, there is this tremendous growth. I do think there's this obsessive desire to find new live sports events, precisely because it has such a distinct value proposition. And we're seeing, there's money flowing into there's 2 women's volleyball leagues that are sort of competing for folks, and we'll see which of those kind of takes off. I like my daughter also plays volleyball. We'll watch college volleyball games, which are great, which are also being broadcast, like which is super fun. You do wonder though if like you hit some point of saturation, or do you think there's just a lot more runway, a lot more growth out there? That this sort of dynamic of the more people see a thing, the more interested they become. There's all sorts of sports they might be into they haven't been exposed to yet, and as things continue to grow, there's a lot more runway for growth.
Yeah, I think there continues to be a lot more runway for growth. I think, the fact that we have all of these emerging sports is a really big deal. Chris, I laugh because I always tell people my son is a pro bass fisherman and he fishes at Auburn. Like, who knew there's
Wait, is that
285
true?
schools? It is true. But the reality is that's what the world is craving, like all of these emerging sports.
He
And I don't
fishes
think
at Auburn. Wow.
yeah, yeah. So I don't think it's going to be a matter of is there a point of saturation? I think there will be a matter of stabilization and we'll start to see more. I mean, economics tells us that things will stabilize, but I think the growth that we're seeing will continue to see, particularly as we all are, so focused on sports as this big asset. And as we look at colleges and universities and what they're bringing to the table. And if we go even further to look at what the Olympics is now adding, right? That all impacts everything.
One of the other strange aspects, along with the sort of gambling, is the role of both fantasy in sports, right? And
Mhm.
particularly the kind of like obsession with the collective bargaining agreement itself and how to game it. So like this is particularly true in basketball. I'm curious to get your feedback. Like there's this thing called the trade machine that people play around with all the time. And like I'm on group chats where people
Mm.
know absolutely like to a granular degree the details of the collective bargaining agreement of the NBA of like how you can structure some contract for someone. And I don't know, life's too short. I've just decided not to invest I'm being very clear. Like I just can't spend the mental energy or cognitive bandwidth on that. Is that funny or weird to you that this has become such a thing? It's particularly true among basketball fans. I think there's a particular thing with basketball fans, baseball to a certain extent, but like it's increasingly a sports fan thing that it's not just it's not just the players that you're rooting for or like the thing that happens on the field, but this kind of investment in like the spreadsheet of the team from a
Oh,
management
yes.
perspective and the
Yes.
exploitation of the various rules.
Yes, yes. You are so right. I mean, people are obsessed with it. In fact, sometimes people tell me detail that I'm like, what? Really? And then I have to run and go check it myself. My colleague has a 12-year-old that can recite the entire CBA. I mean, it used to be that kids would know what engines were in cars and, all of these
Right.
things,
Yeah.
and they could list out every Ford product. Now they can list out the
That's
stats of
so
like
true. It's
hundreds of
exactly what
players.
it is. Yeah.
So I think it's the cycle, right? But it is pretty interesting to watch how it's just sort of permeated society.
I do think there's also something funny about it too, because it ends up there's a funny thing that happens with fantasy sports that it puts you, the fan, in the
Mm.
position of management. Like you're thinking, well, how am I going to do this with the amount of money I have or the contracts that I have? Or is that person worth like, is that person an underappreciated asset? Like it's a strange
Yes.
way that has the way that people relate to sports as opposed to like when I was a kid, it was like, I want to be that player taking the winning shot, right? That
Yes.
was the kind of
Yes.
identification that you had. And now it's like you're identifying with the front office.
Oh, because you're in it. Now you're in the game. So you're really part of it. There was a time when you were looking at it from afar, but now the virtual reality world, you put on your mask and you're actually in the game. You're in the front office. I think that's also changing things for us as well, which is pretty exciting, actually.
I guess the last thing for you is just like, what do you think it means? So what do you think it means just culturally, the sort of as a woman yourself, as someone who has been in both men's and women's sports in different capacities and in these leagues, like for the WNBA to sort of get this labor piece, get the 7-year deal, and keep the biggest and most important women's sports league, I think, in the country, arguably
Mhm.
one of the top 2, but in numbers the biggest, for the sort of continued growth of women's sports specifically.
Yeah. So, to me, this isn't just the end of a negotiation, right? It really is the beginning of a new economic model for women's sports. And to me, that's incredibly exciting. It's the beginning of that. And so I think what we will see in years to come will be how we will all capitalize on this. And I think it's wonderful for the women, but I think it's wonderful for the world too, to be quite honest.
Tamika Tremelio is the former executive director of the National Basketball Players Association. She has been uh, intimately connected with WNBA and others players associations as well. She's managing director at Secretariat, which is a consulting firm where she leads global sports consulting. Learned a lot from that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate your time.